President Putin says Russia reserves the right to use all means to protect citizens in eastern Ukraine. Speaking just in the last couple of hours, he told journalists there in Moscow that the former president, Viktor Yanukovych, was ousted from power in an unconstitutional coup. He said troops in Crimea had been invited in and were not Russian soldiers, but pro-Russian self-defense forces. Those same forces have been involved in this tense standoff with Ukrainian troops at an airbase near Sevastopol in Crimea. Warning shots were fired as the Ukrainians approached, unarmed, to ask for access to their planes.
Сейчас командир придет сюда, ведет. Пожалуйста, командир. Переговоры будут, не вопрос. Да, переговоры будут. Остановите толпу и пускай ведут себя. Всем стоять на месте. Служащие. Стой, Олег Олегович, стой. Мы все военнослужащие, если что. Мы еще граждане. В угоду какому-то одному политическому деятелю мы сейчас столкнуты лбами. Два братских народа. Это неправильно. Вы специально провоцируете. Мы не провоцируем. Мы без оружия. Какая провокация? Я самолет стоит под охрану. А вы нас делаете вообще без оружия.
Pretty eventful stuff there. Lawrence Lee live for us in Simferopol in Crimea. Lawrence, what's the latest we're hearing on this standoff there at Belbek Air Base?
Well, it's over, and I'll come to that in a second, but quite extraordinary, as you've seen, and in many ways the very opposite, excuse me, to the feared military storm that people had worried might happen overnight if the Ukrainians didn't surrender. What happened was at Belbek, Sevastopol's military airport, guarded by Russian troops, these Ukrainians arrived, marched singing the Ukrainian national anthem towards them, demanding that they be given the rights to mend and protect their own aircraft. And you saw in that the Russians firing over their heads, but they carried on regardless. The whole incident, frankly, was over in less than a minute, and once it became clear that the Ukrainian commander was prepared to tell his men to be quiet, "Stoi," he kept saying, "stop," then the Russians seemed to understand that there was a negotiation to be had. And then after that, there were several hours of something of a standoff. A Russian commander was called. He didn't eventually have to turn up. Some of these so-called Crimean self-defense units, civilians, then arrived. But in the meantime, the Ukrainian troops apparently started playing football and at some point later simply just left the base themselves. So what does this all tell you about everything? Well, for a start, clearly it says that many of the Ukrainian troops don't want to defect. They don't want to swear allegiance to the Russians because they were carrying the Ukrainian flag. Similarly, they were carrying a Soviet flag from the Second World War, from when they and the Russians both fought fascism. And I think that's very significant because what it suggests is that they feel highly affronted at the suggestion from Moscow that somehow people down here are in some way supportive of what Moscow calls fascist elements in Kiev. And at the same time, of course, the Russians didn't shoot them. They fired warning shots over their heads. But neither there nor anywhere else, given this apparent overnight ultimatum, have we seen anybody actually get shot. And so it appears that the Russians don't really want to attack the Ukrainians any more than the Ukrainians.
Rory Finnan is the director of the Ukrainian Studies programme at the University of Cambridge in Britain. Joins us now live from London. Thank you very much for being with us. What do you take on this Russian stance that it's legally allowed to be in Crimea and indeed doesn't even have any troops in the region?
It's absurd. It's frankly absurd and preposterous. It's an absurdity and an unfolding nightmare of absurdities. Russia has invaded sovereign and independent Ukraine in clear and unabashed contravention of international law. It's as simple as that. The press conference that Vladimir Putin just gave was a performance of a great deal of incoherence, flat untruths, and really bad strategic policy.
I mean, Putin was absolutely adamant that Ukraine now, the situation there amounts to an unconstitutional coup, that Yanukovych is still the legitimate president. And you have to give it to Putin that he does have a point when he says Yanukovych stuck by the agreement that was made back in February to call snap elections.
He doesn't have a point. The government, the parliament, with clear constitutional authority, impeached him, removed him from office for abuse of power. Yanukovych then fled. If he remained in the country, we could perhaps having a different argument and a different discussion about a different world. But the fact of the matter is, Yanukovych created the situation, and what we're seeing right now in Ukraine and Crimea is simply compensation on Vladimir Putin's and the Kremlin's part. They backed Viktor Yanukovych, who shot at least 94 of his own people, who is a highly corrupt and criminal president. That bet did not pay off. The Ukrainian people legally took power and restored the 2004 constitution that offers them a parliamentary republic. And now Vladimir Putin is compensating for these bad decisions by invading the, Ukraine and Crimea in contravention of international law. It's as simple as that.
What do you think Russia's next move is there then, and what does it actually want?
Honestly, I don't think anyone knows the answer to that question. I think the discussion about what the Kremlin wants here is something of a distraction. I think what we really should be doing is focusing on what Ukraine needs. Ukraine here is in a desperate economic situation. What we need to do is offer it an immediate, ambitious Marshall Plan that can put the country back on better financial footing so that it can pay state salaries, pay pensions. Essentially what I believe is going on is an attempt by the Kremlin to destabilize the fledgling government in Kyiv. A lot of us believe that. It's quite clear he wants to foment public unrest. He's frankly lying that these troops that are surrounding Ukrainian bases are public self-defense units. That is clearly not true. That's a recognition, implicit recognition, that these are Russian troops illegally within the sovereign boundaries of an independent country.
Okay, Rory Finnan, great to get your thoughts. Thanks very much for joining us there from London. Hello there, I'm Laura Kyle. These are our top international headlines. Russian President Vladimir Putin says his country reserves the right to use all means to protect citizens in eastern Ukraine. He's also reiterated Moscow's stand against the ousting of former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych. Also, as Rory Challens is in Moscow, where Putin spoke to journalists on Tuesday.
When they asked him about Yanukovych, he said that Yanukovych is the one and the only rightful president of Ukraine, and that Yanukovych hadn't given the order to shoot protesters. When they asked him about the possibility of Russia being engaged in a war in Ukraine, he said that wasn't going to happen anytime soon, that there was no need for it, but that Russia reserved the right to use force if it felt that it was necessary. And when the journalists asked him about Crimea, he said no, Crimea was not going to be annexed by Russia. It was going to be Crimeans themselves who decide on their future.
Defending its citizens or asserting its dominance on the global stage, President Vladimir Putin defends military intervention in Ukraine. But is Russia's response part of a broader international ambition? This is Inside Story. Russian President Vladimir Putin has been spelling out his position on the crisis in Ukraine and standing firm on the need to use force if it becomes necessary. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. President Putin has told a news conference that the ousting of Ukrainian leader Viktor Yanukovych was an unconstitutional coup and an armed seizure of power. Even so, he said force would only be used by Russia as a last resort. In a measured first response to the crisis, Putin warned that any sanctions against Russia would backfire and any threats would be counterproductive and harmful.
The definition of what's happened in Kiev and in Ukraine as a whole, the definition could be the only one. It's an unconstitutional coup and a military seizure of power. Nobody's arguing with that. We believe Ukraine is not only our closest neighbor, but is indeed our brotherly republic. And our armed forces are brothers in arms, friends. Many of them know each other personally. And I'm confident that Ukrainian soldiers and Russian soldiers won't be on the opposing sides of the barricades. If we see that lawlessness is starting in eastern regions too, if people ask us for help, and we've already an official address from the current legitimate president, we reserve the right to use all options at our disposal to protect those citizens.
Well, while there's been all action and not a lot of talk until now from Russia, it's been all talk and little action from the West. The US was quick to warn there would be costs for any Russian military intervention, later accusing Russia of violating Ukraine's sovereignty. But measures to curb Russia's perceived aggression have so far been limited. The US has suspended all military engagements with Russia. It has frozen trade and investment talks and halted preparations for the G8 summit of Western powers due to be hosted by Russia in Sochi in June. But as EU partners considered putting pressure on Moscow, leaked documents appeared to show some reluctance from Britain. It said Britain should not support for now trade sanctions or close London's financial centre to Russians, underlining the complex economic ties with Russia. Well, let's bring in our guests. In Moscow, Vyacheslav Matuzov, a political commentator and a former Russian diplomat in Washington. In our London studios, we have Ben Judah, visiting fellow at the European Stability Initiative and author of the book Fragile Empire, How Russia Fell In and Out of Love with Vladimir Putin. And joining us from New York is Peter Zalmayev, director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative, which seeks to promote understanding of the former Soviet region in the West. Let's begin in Moscow with Vyacheslav Matuzov. We have heard President Putin portray it as a humanitarian mission. The US Secretary of State John Kerry describes it as a brazen act of aggression. How do you view the Crimean operation?
I watched very attentively and very closely all developments in Maidan in Kiev, all 3 months. And I have my own impression of what was going on. First of all, I was surprised a great role that played in inspiration of Maidani people by American politicians, European parliamentarians, and even official faces from Baltic states. And I can say that I have an impression they were encouraging opposition manifestation to give more efforts to overthrow an existed in Ukraine regime, Viktor Yanukovych. I agree with all those who say that this regime was not good, that was corrupted, that was involved in many criminal schemes, but they were officially and legally elected rulers. I was surprised when people coming from outside, participating in opposition meetings and demanding changing this existing regime in this country. Even State Department person Victoria Nuland and the ambassador of the US in Kiev were exchanging telephones and walking on between
if I may, apologies for interrupting you, Vyacheslav.
It was surprising
but I want to pick up on that issue of the US position a little bit later. But for now, I just want to go to Ben Judah in London and see his feeling. Is this an act of aggression or is it a humanitarian mission as President Putin would have it?
From Putin's point of view, Ukraine has never truly been an independent country. When the Soviet Union dissolved, Russian officials and Russian diplomats presumed that the empire had been converted into a cheap sphere of influence, and these states would sort of stay there, stay in their place. So imagine that if Scotland becomes independent of Great Britain, the English elite might assume that Scotland would just sort of stay there. And for Mr. Putin, what he's watched over the past decade with Western Ukrainian elites and Kiev trying to move away from Russia and towards the European Union and towards NATO, he views as existentially threatening to Russia's identity as a great power. Putin believes that Russia, that has a sphere of influence around it, is a great state, is sort of noble of the name of Russia. Russia that has no sphere of influence around it, which has no client states, is merely a big state. And he believes that that would be the end of Russia's identity, which it's had for millennia. So he thinks he's defending something, and he's defending what is Russia's natural right in these territories.
Well, Peter Zamayev in New York, your view?
Well, I agree with Ben, first of all, that Russia has had a very hard time ever since the breakup of the Soviet Union recognizing the sovereignty of Ukraine, specifically the sovereignty of Ukraine over the Crimean Peninsula, which is now under the occupation of the Russian military. There is a serious and a massive disinformation campaign being waged in Russian media about the true state of affairs in Ukraine. There have been media reports about hundreds of thousands of Russian ethnic Russians fleeing Ukraine for Russia, which is not just an exaggeration, but apparently an outright falsification. We also have reports of busloads of activists from arriving in Ukraine, in eastern towns of Ukraine and in the Crimea from Russia in order to stir up trouble, in order to put on these displays of solidarity with Moscow, asking for Moscow's intervention. So there is a very serious and well-coordinated effort, apparently afoot, in Ukraine to create an impression, at least with the Russian public, that there is a legitimate concern with the safety of the Russian speakers in Ukraine. As a Russian, as an ethnic Russian from the east of Ukraine, as a Ukrainian American, I can say that while there have been issues in the past in Ukraine with the Russian language, it has been a thorny issue. This is an eternal matter for Ukraine. It has been resolved before by Ukrainians. It remains an internal issue for Ukrainians and only Ukrainians to solve. I believe that it was misguided.
Let's just, if I may, Peter, let's just put what you said there to Vyacheslav Matuzov, the allegation there that this is a concocted event, that the reaction of Russians within the Ukraine or native Russians within the Ukraine is not spontaneous. It's part of some kind of plot. Is the assertion there your view of that?
I can say that corruption was absolutely clear, was one of the features of the Yanukovych regime, but he was a legally elected president. I surprise why people who came to demonstrate their resistance to corruption were joined by absolutely unaccepted groups, militarized, with weapons, and good trained. Russia had a very documented examples that some of them were trained in Poland and Baltic states and came to Ukraine from to Kiev from western regions of Ukraine. We know very well what it means, Western Ukraine. It is the motherland of Galician SS division that was, during the Second World War, fighting on the side of Hitler against Soviet army. Until 1955, there were battles with them, in that rest of them in Carpat mountains. We know that very well. We are Russians. And after that, we found them as a driving force of organized, trained and militarized, and Yanukovych gave an order not to shoot.
But if I may, Vyacheslav Matuzov, if you mentioned a bit of history there, but Russia actually gave Crimea to the Ukraine in 1954, about the time you were recounting those events. So the territory was ceded.
That's right. That's right, because Nikita Khrushchev, while after Stalin's death, was trying to bring Ukrainian political bureau of Ukrainian Communist Party's leadership on his side. He was originally from Donetsk, Nikita Khrushchev. He was Ukrainian origin, and he was trying to drive Ukrainian leadership to his side in his struggle against groups in Moscow with Politburo to gain the power, and he received it. And as a thankful position, he gave to Ukraine Crimea. But you remember that Sevastopol, a military city, never been a part of Crimea area. He was directly from Moscow ruled, governed, because it was military base and it was not responsible to Ukrainian authorities. He was responsible to Moscow exactly, and that's why when it was Crimea was joined, nobody told to Khrushchev that Crimea and Sevastopol is the same picture.
But if I may just go to Peter, apologies for interrupting you, but if I may go to Peter Zalmayev on that particular point that you make there, that Russia has some kind of historical claim to the Crimea, which it is exercising now in terms of this operation. What's your view of that?
Well, my view is that ever since the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine has been recognized in its current borders, including Crimea, as a sovereign state. So no matter what deep down inside Russian politicians have thought about the Crimea and its true owner, for the last 2 decades, the official position of the Russian government has been to recognize Ukraine as a sovereign state in its present borders. So the military incursion that we're witnessing right now is a violation of Ukraine's sovereignty.
Well, let's just pick up on a particular point that Vyacheslav Matuzov made a little bit earlier, right at the beginning, and I want to put it to you, Ben Judah. We heard from President Putin that there are double standards. He pointed out in his news conference that the US, for example, acted in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, either without UN resolutions or twisting UN resolutions, as he puts it. He is arguing that Russia is acting in exactly the same way, and yet it gets criticized, while countries like the US does not. Is there a bias, a particularly Western bias against Russian action?
I think the most important thing to understand about how Vladimir Putin sees the West right now is that Vladimir Putin knows how Russian corruption works. Russian corruption works like this. Billions and billions and billions of dollars are stolen from Russian state companies and Russian budgets. Where do they go? They don't go to Russia, they don't go to China, they don't go to the Gulf. The money comes to London. The money goes to Geneva. The money goes to French chateaus. It goes to Austrian bank accounts. Who are the people bringing this money in? These are Western elites. It's British bankers, it's French bankers, it's German accountants, it's Italian lawyers, and this money is being invested in the Western economy and is the only way in an era of low growth that Western elites are making cash. In Britain, our Prime Minister David Cameron says Britain is open for business. Even though that sounds lovely, what in practice that means is that London's centre is being sold off to Russian oligarchs, British football teams are being sold off to Russian oligarchs, and the City of London is opening itself up to giant Russian state corporations' investment. Putin believes that he has the West down to a T. He believes that the West is a hypocrite and that Britain, France and Germany, contemporary Western Europe, has the morality of a hedge fund. It may talk about anti-corruption, but all it really wants to do is get the money and take it offshore. When Putin looks at Brussels, when Putin looks at Britain, and in particular at London, he sees a country that issues these empty statements about anti-corruption and how it deplores human rights, but he knows perfectly well where Russian dirty money goes. It goes to Britain's empire of tax havens over which the sun never sets, from Gibraltar to the British Virgin Islands.
Well, let's just pause at this particular point and look at more detail into this area of perceived weakness. Now, while US President Barack Obama has been preoccupied with pulling troops out of areas of conflict and the EU has appeared increasingly fragmented, Russia has been carefully extending its influence abroad. In 2008, it went to war with Georgia over 2 breakaway regions. South Ossetia and Abkhazia are now virtual sections of Russia. Russia has also been repositioning itself strategically, regarded by its allies as a symbol of resistance against the West. It's becoming an influential member of the negotiating team with Iran. a pivotal player on Syria, using its UN veto to thwart resolutions against Bashar al-Assad's government. And President Putin has backed the presidential bid by Egypt's military leader, Field Marshal Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, something Barack Obama has yet to do. Now, looking at all of this, and I'll come back to you, Ben-Judah, can we look at Crimea in isolation, or is it perhaps part of a wider Russian strategy at a time where it perceives, as you've just mentioned, weaknesses in what in the past were its enemies?
Vladimir Putin thinks that the Western elite is the weakest Western elite since the 1930s. He thinks that David Cameron is pathetic. He thinks that François Hollande in France is pathetic. He thinks that Angela Merkel in Germany is pathetic. And he views Barack Obama as more think tanker than leader. Putin has been slowly moving to provoke the West on all of the fronts that you've mentioned. There have been provocations in Syria. There have been provocations over Edward Snowden. And Putin knows where his weakness is. He knows where his vulnerability is. The only thing that can hurt Putin is the money. And all of that money is in Western Europe. Let's be clear about one thing. In the 21st century, banks are more important than tanks. And the only thing that can stop Putin would be American and European sanctions on the financial services that they offer, impacting on the companies that keep the Russian state going and clamping down on Russian corruption. But because Putin thinks the Western elite is enthralled to hedge funders and investment bankers, is a Western elite that dreams of nothing more than making a profit in emerging markets and hiding the money in the British Virgin Islands. He thinks that nobody will stop him. Like, what this war, and it is a war, is about proving that Russia can act without consequences in any of the territories of the former Soviet Union.
Well, let's just go then. Let's just go then, if I may, to Vyacheslav Matuzov on this particular issue. Is there a wider foreign policy initiative evolving under President Putin, of which the Crimea is just a part, and in fact the latest in a series of steps where President Putin has been enlarging Russia's sphere of influence?
Well, I think it is great mistakes of US analytics and politicians when they are thinking that Russia should be from in the first class in the school, and that they can, as a teachers, punish. To make some punishment for Russia, and to teach her how to behave on international scene. I think that is a great mistake, because Russia is a partner of the United States, but not as a pure boy in the first stage of the school, secondary school. I think it should be another approach to the issue. They mentioned Syria, they mentioned Middle East, maybe Egypt, Russian stance towards Egyptian development, Syrian development, Iran development. So, and now in Ukraine, and Edward Snowden. Please, Russia has their own view. Russia has own position. And that shouldn't follow instructions from White House, from State Department. They should understand motivation of Russian position in towards Egyptian regime, towards Syrian regime, towards Ukrainian regime. Understand why Russia behaves in such way in Ukraine.
Well, let's just go to Peter Zalmayev on that particular point.
Situation in Ukraine,
if I may go to Peter Zalmayev on this particular point, is there a misunderstanding of Russian intent, as we've heard there, that it has been treated as a second-class cousin in the community of nations, and this is its response? Is there any validity to that?
There has been, Russia has been very much aggrieved in the past decade or so with the Western sort of dismissal of its import and its role in international affairs. And recently it has been a crucial partner with the West in the talks about Iran and in the efforts underway to try to resolve the crisis in Syria. But the question is whether tanks in Ukraine, whether military presence in the breakaway republics of Georgia is really a way for Russia to assert its rightful place in international affairs. If the sanctions, if Western sanctions, whether they're forthcoming or not, have an effect or not, markets have already started to punish Russia. Yesterday morning, the Russian stock exchange opened to a precipitous decline in its index. The Russian ruble has been tumbling, reaching its all-time lows. So if it's not going to be sanctions, then the economy will hurt Russia, and I do not think it will be. It will contribute to its long-term goal to assert its rightful role in international affairs.
Well, let's just go to Ben Judah on that particular point. We're talking about sanction. It's not clear exactly what proper sanctions are or will be applied. Yet what can be done? There has been an economic blowback in Russian markets, certainly we've heard about that, and yet there does appear to be no sense of concern in the Russian leadership about factors like this. They appear to be set on a course and will not be dissuaded by sanction or threat of sanction.
Well, as I've been trying to say throughout this programme, Putin knows that the Western European elites, this elite of financiers, this elite that funds political parties, this elite of which there is a revolving door with politics in Britain, France and Germany, is absolutely dependent on Russian investment continuing to come into London, Paris and Berlin, and has its own money in tax havens and is not going to kill the oligarch golden goose that feeds it. You know, Putin believes that the likelihood of Western sanctions is nil on the key banks that matter.
So,
what we've seen yesterday is stunning.
What you are saying, Ben Judah,
finish?
is that basically what is propping up Vladimir Putin is Western self-interest, particularly financial self-interest.
What I'm saying is that Western financial elites are partners in Russian corruption as long as they continue to help stolen money in Russia be extracted and placed securely in the West. Yesterday, there was a stunning report from the Guardian newspaper, in which was a photo of a position paper being taken within number 10 Downing Street, which was a response to John Kerry's mention that sanctions could be placed on Russia. And guess what was number 1 on the list of number 10's positions, which was no harm should be taken, no sanctions should be placed that harmed the interests of the City of London. Now, that's code for no harm on Putin's banks in London because British bankers make money for them. No harm on Russian oligarch property in London because London estate agents make money for them. That's code for no harm on the registering of Russia's state oil companies on the London Stock Exchange. London brokers make money for them. Those are the only things that can hurt Putin. Those are the only things that could stop him. And when Putin knows that the other points on the number 10 position papers were theatrical military manoeuvres at most somewhere within Europe, what's he got to be afraid of? Nothing.
Well, at that particular point, my thanks to our guests, Vyacheslav Matuzov, Ben Judah and Peter Zalmayev. And why not join us in this discussion online? Leave us your thoughts and your comments at Facebook or Twitter. I'm Mike Hanna. Thank you for watching. Goodbye for now.
They are facing off on the ground and on the airwaves. While the diplomatic war of words intensifies around Ukraine, so too the physical confrontations. The US Secretary of State John Kerry, who is in Kiev, has condemned what he's called Russia's act of aggression, and he has promised $1 billion in US aid for Ukraine. Talking at Moscow earlier, President Vladimir Putin said Russia will use all means necessary to protect citizens in eastern Ukraine. He says the ousted President Viktor Yanukovych was pushed from power in an unconstitutional coup. And pro-Russian forces here involved in a standoff with Ukrainian soldiers at an airbase in Ukraine's Crimea region. Warning shots were fired by the Russians into the air as the Ukrainians approached unarmed to ask for access to their planes. And that is where we begin our coverage with this report from Hoda Abdulhamid.
In Belbek, the Ukrainians' marching songs were met with Russian gunfire. Shots fired into the air, warning the troops to stay back. "Hey, we're local too," the men shouted. The Ukrainians carry a Soviet flag from the Second World War, as if reminding the Russians there was a time when these two sides were fighting together.
Мы все военнослужащие, если что. Мы еще граждане.
В угоду какому-то одному политическому деятелю мы сейчас столкнуты лбами. Два братских народа. Это неправильно.
Вы специально провоцируете.
Мы не провоцируем. Мы без оружия. Какая провокация? Здесь самолеты стоят под охрану.
But the standoff didn't last long. A Russian commander had been called, but was told to hold off when it became clear neither side was willing to fight. There was even a lull when a football match is played under the watch of Russian soldiers. But when Crimean self-defense units arrive, the Ukrainians fall in and march off, their point made. So the Ukrainian soldiers came out of their base and were heading towards the airstrip because they wanted to reach the weapons depot. And that's when they were stopped by the Russians. Now, there have been negotiations throughout the day between the Ukrainian and the Russian commanders. We still don't have the outcome. The overnight deadlines for Ukrainian troops to give up the Russians passed with no sign of the military storm that had been threatened. Moscow denied that there was ever a deadline. In the Crimean port city of Kerch, this soldier said none of his team would vow allegiance to the new pro-Russian Crimean government.
Marines never surrender. Nobody at the base wants to switch sides to take an oath of loyalty to a dubious government which has not been elected legally.
Defiance, even though their base is surrounded by Russian troops without insignia, and the Russian mainland is just 4.5 kilometers away across a stretch of water. And in Sevastopol, another standoff of sorts. Ukrainian ships flanked by Russian ones, watching their every movement. The regional capital Simferopol was quiet. Some volunteer security staff guard the parliament, but there's no sign of the armed men in balaclavas who'd been here the day before. Hud Abdelhamid, Al Jazeera, Crimea.
As Russia weighs up its next move, so too does the West. The US has already suspended military operations and says it could take aim at Russia's state-run financial institutions. The UK, though, appears to be taking a more cautious approach.
We have urged Russia to meet its international commitments and to choose a path out of confrontation and military action.
Addressing the House of Commons on his return from Kiev, British Foreign Secretary William Hague avoided threatening any trade sanctions against Russia, a strategic move given the UK and the EU may not be able to afford it. Trade between Russia and the US is worth around $42 billion a year, and US exports to Russia are worth around $1 billion annually. But compared to the US, trade between the EU and Russia is far more significant. It's worth around $460 billion a year. A lot of that comes from Russia's gas, with the EU importing around 35% of its gas from Russia, earning the Kremlin almost $100 million a day. But conversely, the European Union is Russia's biggest investor, making up 75% of direct foreign investment. So while Russia may have its hand on the gas tap, it may prove too costly to turn off.
The latest Russian economic data that we've seen so far has shown that the Russian economy is actually slipping into recession. So they need the gas and oil revenues to actually keep their economy going.
The UK's willingness to impose economic sanctions has been further called into question after a secret government document was reportedly photographed as it was carried into Downing Street. The document said Britain should not impose trade sanctions, nor should it close London's financial centre, but rather that it should look to joining other EU members in considering travel bans and visa restrictions.
The UK says the leaked document should not be seen as a guide to British policy, insisting all options for its response to Russia remain on the table. But those options could be driven by purse strings rather than politicians, with the markets ultimately in control. Kim Vanel, Al Jazeera, London.
Hello, I'm Lauren Taylor with the headlines on Al Jazeera. Russian President Vladimir Putin says he reserves the right to use his military to protect Russians in Ukraine. In a news conference in Moscow, he accused Western nations of driving Ukraine into anarchy. Meanwhile, US Secretary of State John Kerry is in Ukraine and has accused Russia of an act of aggression. John Hendren has more from Kiev.
Well, it was a big deal that Kerry came here. It was a major symbolic effort. He is the highest profile foreign official to come here to Independence Square since all of this happened with the Russian incursion into Crimea. He offered some very tough words for the Russians. He offered some supportive words for the Ukrainians. He said, "We want to help you." He went on to say they stood up for democracy and they got snipers' bullets.
Well, let's talk to John Squire, former Ukraine Program Officer at the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, D.C. John Squire, the U.S. Secretary of State there, John Kerry, accusing Moscow of looking for an excuse to invade Ukraine. But he also, on the other hand, urged Russia's leaders to resolve the crisis through diplomacy. Do you think we're near to having this crisis diffused anytime soon, do you think?
I really have my doubts about it being diffused immediately. I think the immediate threat of an invasion of eastern Ukraine has been walked back some. Certainly Putin's comments recently have indicated that. But I do think that the Russian troops are in Crimea and they're likely to stay there for a long time. I don't think that Mr. Putin is very likely to want to appear weak by withdrawing his troops immediately. And I think that there's therefore a very good possibility that there's going to be a pretty high level of violence in the near future.
Yeah, let's stay with Vladimir Putin for a while because he remains defiant in Moscow. Do you think he's painted himself into an awkward position because he can't maintain control of Crimea without there being violence, as you say, and a huge regional and international backlash?
Yes, I think that he has painted himself into a corner. If he withdraws, he loses a lot of the credibility that he exercises in what Russians now refer to as the near abroad, the countries of the former Soviet Union. But if he doesn't withdraw, I think that he's going to face the condemnation of Western countries, and he's going to face sanctions of various sorts. And I think that given the two possibilities, he's going to go with the one that has gone with before, which is the use of force to get his way.
What about the situation in Ukraine itself? I mean, this crisis seems to have exposed deep divisions in the country. Some experts say even that there's a fifth column in the country aimed at undermining Ukrainian sovereignty.
I would say that there is there's some degree of that. That's indisputable. There are organizations, particularly in Crimea, interestingly enough, that I've seen that were very definitely funded by Russia and that took a very hard pro-Moscow line. You also hear reports of demonstrators, for example, being bussed in from Russia to cities like Donetsk and Kharkiv in the western part of the country. But at the same time, I think that this is also creating a few more enemies than friends in Ukraine for Mr. Putin. I think probably a lot of Russian-speaking Ukrainian citizens are looking at Moscow and they're really wondering what would happen to them. Certainly there's been a few indications that even Russians in Crimea, where Russians I think feel the most secure in Ukraine, I think there's indications that they're taking exception to the military occupation.
Let me get a final thought from you, John Squire. What do you think Russia's endgame is here? What's likely to be the longer regional and political impact of this crisis?
I think there are going to be really two things that are likely to happen. One is that I think Crimea will probably stay under Russian control for the foreseeable future. I also think, however, that this is ultimately going to weaken Russia's position with regard to the countries of the former Soviet Union. And in particular, it's going to strengthen rather than weaken Ukrainian statehood. And I think there's quite a lot that we can do to support the country in that regard.
John Squire, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you, Darren.
A visit from Ukraine's most powerful Western ally. The US Secretary of State arrives to pile on the pressure for Russia to withdraw its troops from Crimea. And he brings badly needed good news, $1 billion in US economic support. But first, he made a pilgrimage to Independence Square, the heart of the uprising. He paid tribute to those who, as he put it, stood for democracy, but were met with snipers' bullets. After meeting Ukraine's new leaders, the Secretary of State reaffirmed American support for its independence and called on Russia to do the same.
It is diplomacy
and respect for sovereignty, not unilateral force, that can best solve disputes like this in the 21st century.
And there was a threat of what would happen if Russia continued to follow the military route.
If Russia does not choose to de-escalate, if it is not willing to work directly with the government of Ukraine, as we hope they will be, then our partners will have absolutely no choice but to join us to continue to expand upon steps we have taken in recent days in order to isolate Russia politically, diplomatically, and economically.
No Western partner is offering to go to war on Ukraine's behalf. Only economic and political sanctions are on the table, and these have limited effect. That's because Europe is dependent on Russia for energy, and any attempt to isolate Moscow diplomatically could also backfire. The West wants to avoid escalating this crisis at all costs. Jackie Rowland, Al Jazeera, Kiev.